All emotions of the inhabitants of real space, whatever form they take, are not simply kept internalized. Instead, they are reflected into the Immaterium, where they can take a physical form of sorts and coalesce into entities formed from pure emotion. In a galaxy so ridden with war and suffering for millennia, it is no surprise that the negative emotions are the most strongly felt, causing the entities formed from them to become the most powerful of their kind. Eventually, the consumption of and dominance over the lesser entities left 4 or a few more to become deities unto themselves, able to create vast armies from their incomprehensible power and extend their will into the Immaterium. They are known by many names across the races of the galaxy, but collectively they are known most often as the Ruinous Powers or the Chaos Gods. This is Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to 40k Stories. The Chaos Gods have been around, potentially, for as long as there have been sentient souls in the galaxy, even though they may not have been classified as such back then. Certainly the warp has always been there, and the emotions and souls of real space's inhabitants have always been echoed in it. As the civilizations and species of the Immaterium grew more populous and powerful, these echoes became stronger, especially amongst the races with more psychic potential. These tides of emotion were eventually able to take some kind of form, which we know today as the Chaos Gods. These entities were able to act independently of the emotions that formed and sustained them, and it is believed that there were many more of them than the 4 best known today, at least in the pre-independence phase and possibly after. However, as the gods were formed from emotion, they often acted in ways befitting those emotions, causing there to be ambitious schemes and acts of violence between them. Whilst time in the warp is impossible to measure by any of our own chronologies, after a while the most powerful of the emotion entities would consume, dominate, or otherwise destroy the others, leaving them as multifaceted beings fueled by more emotions. From there, the gods realised that they could gain more power for themselves by causing more of their defining emotions to be felt in real space, and those with the power to do so would reach into the minds of its denizens to encourage certain acts. This would evolve into the veneration of the gods that we see now from the forces of chaos, but it started much smaller. It is believed that by the time the entities that would become the gods gained sentience, there were only the 4 or 5 that are still around today, which would suggest that they were the only ones to ever exist, or that the consumption and destruction of the lesser entities was in some way subconscious. Either way, the first of the Chaos Gods to achieve sentience and awaken did so in M2 by our calendar, with the last coming many millennia later. They have only grown in power and ambition since their awakening, having become aware of the affairs of real space and of their own lust for power. Each of the gods established their own domain within the Immaterium, incalculably vast regions shaped by the god's will and expanding or shrinking as the deity's power waxes or wanes. After all, a realm in such perpetual flux as the warp would never allow for stability, and though they are independent of thought, the gods are still affected by it and the emotions reflected in it. This feeds back to the idea of the gods reaching into real space to whisper in the minds of mortals, trying to foment more of their emotions in such a way as to increase their influence in the warp whilst diminishing those of the other gods. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given their consumption or destruction of the minor gods, the ruinous powers are almost constantly warring with each other as well, in what is known as the Great Game. Sometimes this takes the form of proxy wars in the Immaterium, using mortal champions to duke it out for tangible territory and the influence that comes with it. Other times, mortals are used as agents, undermining the schemes of the other gods to prevent them gaining power. However, the most common conflict between the Chaos Gods is one that the Immaterium will likely never see nor understand. The gods are able to siphon off a fraction of their own power to create the entities known as demons, and such is the power of the ruinous powers that they can create ridiculously vast armies of them without becoming overly weakened. Though many know this, and many more have witnessed the Neverborn in action, especially recently, the majority of a demon's time is actually spent fighting in the warp against the demons of the other gods as part of the Great Game. The gods are content to throw their armies at each other eternally, though some champions, both mortal and demonic, will take more direct actions. But there have been occasions when the game itself has been paused to allow the gods to work together. The amount of times this has happened is believed to be very rare, but the Horus Heresy and the Gathering Storm before the return of Robert Guilliman are the best known examples. This is always done with at least a measure of selfishness, but there exists an interesting relationship between the Chaos Gods and the Emperor of Mankind. Even moving past the whispered idea that the Emperor is a Chaos God, which I quite like conceptually but would never be able to prove, the entire premise of the Great Crusade was to unite humanity, but also to defeat the ruinous powers. The Emperor wished to convert the entire galaxy to his atheistic imperial truth, believing that to do so would cause the Chaos Gods to starve and become irrevocably weakened due to humanity's lack of faith in them and the death of everything else. This, by the way, is why the Great Game was put on pause to engineer the Horus Heresy. Even if it couldn't kill them, the gods, at least in theory, had a lot to fear from the Emperor and his actions. Whilst this actually sounds like a very clever idea in principle, the Emperor made a few major errors with this that even the gods may not have realised. They're powerful, but they're not always that intelligent, and please don't hit me. You see, the Chaos Gods aren't just fueled by worship as the Emperor seemed to be believing. They're fueled by emotion, with humanity probably being the largest contributor to most of them purely because of sheer numbers. So even if you wipe out all worship and knowledge of the ruinous powers, which you can't, as I'll explain in a moment, there will still be plenty of fuel emotionally going into the warp to keep the gods going, especially since humanity would become even more numerous in the event of total galactic conquest. The second is this pesky thing that all tyrants like the Emperor seem to hate: free will. The Galar have proved throughout history to be exceptionally bad at doing what they're told and conforming to the rules. It's done them a lot of good, and I don't mean it as a critique, but it does mean that trying to eradicate the Chaos Gods from human memory or lore would be next to impossible. Cults would spring up diving underground. Old traditions of many worlds like Colchis would persist in secret, and there'd be nothing to stop the weakened gods, or their demons if they still existed, from whispering into the minds of humans everywhere to secretly inform, twist, and corrupt them. In essence, what I'm saying is that the Chaos Gods are immortal. If you want to get rid of them, you have to cut the entire galaxy's connection to the warp or purge them of all emotion. Both of which are, as far as I know, absolutely impossible, though maybe that's what the Imperial Webway project was for, I'm not sure. As a result, even if the warp were to recede to levels not seen since before the fall of the Eldari, I suspect that the galaxy will, sadly, never be rid of chaos nor its gods. By the same logic, however, there must be a galaxy and a real space left alive to provide the gods with fuel. If demons overran and purged the entire Immaterium, the gods could quite easily be weakened, if not destroyed, since there's no worship and no emotion anymore. This is another reason for the gods to recruit mortal followers. They're a source of easy emotion and action, sure, but it means that chaos dominion over the galaxy would not involve extinction for the galaxy either. The whole thing creates a strangely symbiotic relationship. The gods need mortals to provide the souls and the emotional power, whilst the mortals cannot truly be alive without the emotions that define the gods in the first place. Now that we at least have some more of an understanding about the nature of the Chaos Gods, let's dive into some details. There are 4 major Chaos gods as well as a few less known or lesser ones that we'll address at the end, but I feel like we should start with the one I consider to be the most powerful, at least probably these days. That is the blood god Khorne, or as it is known in its truer name in the Dark Tongue, Karneth. The reason I feel Khorne is the strongest of the gods is about as simple as the god itself seems to be. Khorne is all about blood, skulls, murder, violence, wrath, and engineering all of that in the deadliest way possible. Given the amount of war and strife constantly unfolding across the galaxy, it would stand to reason that Khorne would benefit greatly from the associated emotions being so abundant, whether that's due to its devotees or not. It is believed that Khorne first awakened and gained sentience early in M2, the first of the major Chaos gods to do so, in fact, bringing an age of war to Terra and probably elsewhere as a result. To be a worshipper of Khorne is to give oneself over to rage, with all being warriors of some kind and many going insane in their need to kill. There are those champions of Khorne who claim that the god stands for martial honour and whatnot, and become duelists, but they fall firmly into the minority compared to the hordes of berserk killers. Whilst violence is probably Khorne's minimum expectation and demand, all servants of the blood god know that there is more that they can offer, something more tangible. There is a saying when it comes to Karneth: Khorne cares not from whence the blood flows. By extrapolating this to the natural extreme, something that you will probably always do, given it's the Chaos gods, it can be assumed that Khorne just cares about the flow of blood out of people's bodies, no matter who causes it or who the victims are. This has proven to be true over and over again, and so followers of Khorne are able to empower the blood god not just by killing everything in sight, but also by being killed as well. It is not seen as counteractive to Khorne's wishes to kill your allies or other followers of the blood god. In fact, it's practically encouraged. If you need an example, look at what Kharn the Betrayer did at Scalathrax to the World Eaters, his own legion. For those truly devoted champions, they can bear the mark of Khorne, granting them even more power in melee combat and the iconic rune of the blood god as well. The common war cry for Khorne's worshippers is blood for the blood god and skulls for the skull throne. The first part we've addressed already. Kill stuff, spill blood, Khorne is happy. But the latter is a reference to Khorne's domain within the Immaterium, specifically the Brass Citadel at the heart of its fortress where Khorne is said to live. The Skull Throne is in fact a titanic brass throne with an ever-growing pile of skulls underneath it, those taken by Khorne's followers and the ones of the now dead followers too, piling up eternally. The throne room is lit by the burning souls of cowards who fled in combat, whilst the citadel's moat is filled with the boiling blood of the victims of war. But the fortress of Khorne is more than the brass citadel. The blood pits are akin to a demon's spawning ground. The forges create legions of demon engines and are manned by warriors who died in their sleep. And the cries of war and the clashing of weapons are ceaseless across the blood god's domain. As for Khorne itself, the most common depictions of the blood god show a gigantic warrior with a face akin to a hound, a voice of pure rage, and iron and brass armour. It is a being that despises sorcery and eschews the use of psychic powers by its followers, aside from that one librarian that we don't talk about. Melee combat is the only way to do things for Khorne, and the gods that specialise in the sorcerous art, notably Tzeentch, who we'll get to, are reviled in turn. Only once, I believe, has anyone dared to approach the Skull Throne and attack Khorne directly. The bloodthirster Skarbrand, most powerful warrior in the Blood Legions and the chosen of Khorne itself, barely even made a dent. Khorne also carries a sword, which is known by many names, though it has only been used once and never against another god to our knowledge. The legends say that Khorne's rage once became so great and all-consuming, well, even more so than usual, that the blood god struck the ground with the sword and split it for eternity. This might explain the titanic canyon that cuts through the bone-covered wasteland inside Khorne's domain, though having not been there in a while, I cannot confirm or deny. We won't get into the actual armies of Khorne, the Blood Legions, in this log, as I've explored them across a number of logs in the past. But there is one thing of interest that applies not just to Khorne, but to all of the Chaos Gods. Sacred numbers. No one knows quite why these things exist or for what purpose they're there, but they are specific numbers that seem to be important or symbolic to each Chaos God. Khorne's number, for example, is 8, and you see it all the time across Khorne's domain, armies and followers. There are 8 tiers of Bloodthirster ranks. There are 8 towers that form the Brass Citadel, rituals involve 8 rites or sacrifices, and many, many more. It is even said that after 8 ages of war have passed, Khorne's bloodthirst will somehow be sated and satisfied in a final battle. I doubt this somehow, since that would entirely change the defining emotions of Khorne, but hey, you never know. Next on our list, and probably next most powerful in my opinion, of the Chaos Gods is Tzeentch, also known most commonly as the Architect of Fate or the Changer of Ways, though with the current psychic awakening that's going on, maybe now it is most powerful of all. Not sure. As its epithets would suggest, Tzeentch is a deity concerned primarily with change and with fate, specifically manipulating and changing fate to benefit one's own ends. As change is given form through the magical arts, Tzeentch is also the most powerful chaos god in all matters sorcerous, with almost every one of its demonic servants able to manifest some kind of psychic power, and many mortal followers being psychically gifted as well. It is thought that Tzeentch awakened second amongst the major chaos gods, not long after Khorne even by human measurement. But unlike the blood god who is worshipped brazenly through war, Tzeentch takes a subtler approach. Much of Tzeentch's work is done in the shadows, through agents and schemes that can be immeasurably complex and long, even beyond the comprehension of those carrying them out. If an individual wishes for change in their life, whether it be an escape from servitude, a way off their planet, or whatever else, that is what powers Tzeentch above all else, with the capricious ambition of humanity proving a most abundant source. It is said that Tzeentch is able to hear every single scheme or plan conducted by mortals and concocted, even if only in their own heads, using this information of what may be to come as a means of seeing all outcomes and fates. The architect can then directly or indirectly guide the denizens of real space to realise their goals or be led to failure, allowing things to pan out just as planned and in a way that ultimately benefit Tzeentch. However, it can be impossible for any save Tzeentch to actually comprehend the actions taken in some cases, as the acts seem entirely contradictory and the motivations are entirely hidden. But according to Tzeentch, everything is still going exactly as planned, even if no one actually knows what the plan is. Often these plans are really schemes within plots or wrapped up in a conspiracy and tied with an enigma. So don't try to understand it. Honestly, you'll just go mad. One aspect of Tzeentch's work we think we do understand is the one involving the god's former staff. When Tzeentch had this crystal staff, it was said that it was dominant over the Immaterium, by far the most powerful of the Chaos Gods. But as often happens in the great game, if one god gets too powerful, the others allied themselves together for a time in order to bring things back to a more level playing field. As proof of sincerity, Tzeentch shattered the staff into pieces that would go on to become all spells and incantations in the Immaterium, but the god has dispatched a pair of demons to try and write them all down and thus reforge the staff. As a result, it is often thought that Tzeentch's grand scheme is simply to gain power and win the great game. Sometimes the answer is simple, even with such complex entities as the Chaos Gods, but I do not wish to overspeculate. The followers of Tzeentch, just like their patron deity, are schemers extraordinaire, often concocting labyrinth plans of their own, and sometimes falling into the trap of serving Tzeentch without even realising. Their thirst for knowledge, something Tzeentch also seeks, leaves them vulnerable to manipulation or guidance from the Changer of Ways, both requested and unseen. Whilst they will typically find nothing from servitude to Tzeentch, often being unwittingly led down a route to damnation instead, by far the worst fate is reserved for any unfortunate enough to find Tzeentch's domain within the warp, the Crystal Labyrinth. Being formed of ever-shifting crystal laced with magic, the labyrinth is capable of twisting the emotions of all within it from hope to despair, and so on. Some say there is a guardian in there, posing riddles at each of several gates that must be correctly answered to avoid wandering the labyrinth for all eternity with a broken mind. It requires a true insanity beyond almost anyone to navigate the labyrinth, and so no demons are ever needed to guard the thing, aside from maybe this rumoured guardian. But somewhere in there is the home of Tzeentch, the so-called impossible fortress. Whilst the entire Immaterium is rather impossible to our comprehension, treating the laws of physics as guidelines at the best of times, the impossible fortress is an ever-shifting place where space-time stands still and even demons are ripped apart by the impossibility if they try to traverse it. Tzeentch itself is located within a place known as the Hidden Library, a shifting inner sanctum of the fortress that, as the name suggests, is a library of knowledge. In this case, the Hidden Library contains all knowledge and thoughts from across all of space-time, with hordes of Tzeentch's lesser demons tending to the tomes that are as malevolent as all other things associated with the ruinous powers that ensnare the demons to absorb their energy. Perhaps surprisingly, there is something of a known appearance or form for the Architect of Fate. Whilst there is change going on all across its body, the god seems to be some necklace, shoulder-horned creature at its core. Commonly, it is depicted as a writhing serpent of sorts by mortals, signifying the constant change that the Changer of Ways embodies. Tzeentch's demonic servants are known as the Scintillating Legions, and there are lots of them, divided into 9 hosts each. The most favoured 9 legions are given command of a fractal fortress within the labyrinth, whilst many rituals to summon them or otherwise serve Tzeentch require things in multiples of 9. Yes, if you hadn't worked it out yet, Tzeentch's sacred number is 9. Personally, I think 8 would have been better because that's an infinity symbol and thus an endless loop and such, but that's probably just me. Moving on from Tzeentch, we come to the third Chaos God to awaken. Tzeentch's antithesis, in fact, Nurgle. Known commonly as the Plague Father or the Lord of Decay, the direct translation of its Dark Tongue name, great pestilence came in the wake of Nurgle's awakening. The Plague Father is associated, shockingly enough, with plagues and the like, causing its followers to become victims, carriers and vectors for all manner of horrific diseases. And yet Nurgle and its devotees are often depicted as the cheeriest of all within the armies of chaos because of what Nurgle represents on a conceptual level. Whilst Tzeentch's power of change is often drawn from hopes, ambitions, a desire to do something new, Nurgle's joviality comes from acceptance of one's fate, taking comfort in one's situation and finding peace in that, no matter how dire it may be. This idea of stagnancy, acceptance, a refusal to change, is what places Nurgle in opposition to Tzeentch, with its followers quite often going up against Tzeentch's schemers to drown them in stagnancy. But just like the Architect of Fate influences mortals to bring them under its sway, so too does the Plague Father. Quite often, those mortals who end up serving Nurgle will have prayed to it for a measure of salvation from the diseases that ail them, having exhausted all other options against the plagues manifesting quite often from Nurgle's own effects upon their souls. You want an example? See the Death Guard Legion and their Primarch Mortarion. The Lord of Decay will grant relief, but not a cure, twisting those who beseech it to take satisfaction in accepting their fate rather than denying and fighting against their illnesses. Such is Nurgle's way, though quite what the Plague Father's end goal is remains unclear. Infecting the whole Immaterium would be nice and provide a serious power boost for the great game, but it's not exactly clear what Nurgle is working towards. It is easy to track Nurgle's place in the balance of power, however, at least if you can find a way to measure the warp and avoid becoming infected by everything. This is because, more than even the Crystal Labyrinth, the realm of Nurgle within the Immaterium is alive and reactive to the strength of its creator. The Garden of Nurgle, as it is known, would be a paradise for the Plague Father and its followers, but a nightmare to all others. Everything is alive despite the rotting and the stench of death, a bounty of pestilent afflictions and twisted flora and fauna. Between the natural defences and the demonic defenders, the garden is as impenetrable as the domains of the other Chaos Gods, but unlike perhaps the Fortress of Khorne, it waxes and wanes as all nature does, even warp-based. Granted, this ebb and flow of growth and recession is not tied to seasons due to the lack of them in the Immaterium. Instead, the power of Nurgle within the Great Game is the determining factor. When the Lord of Decay is ascendant, even the Crystal Labyrinth is not spared from the encroaching garden for a time, but as the balance of power shifts, so too does the garden's limits. Were one to overcome the obstacles, plagues and nightmares within the garden and arrive at its core, you would be greeted by the seemingly rotted but still incredibly strong home of the Plague Father, Nurgle's Manse, the blighted mansion of misery and mirth. Good name, despite the connotations. Within this vast edifice resides not one, but in fact two gods, one of chaos and one of the Eldari of all races. The legend goes that one of the other Chaos gods, Slaanesh, who we'll get to in a moment, sought to claim and consume the Eldari gods for reasons that will become apparent. Isha, however, cried out for aid, and Nurgle heard her, went to war with Slaanesh to claim her, and won. Nurgle took Isha and kept her in its manse as a prisoner come guest, come test subject. The Plague Father spends the vast majority of its time slaving away at the titanic cauldron in the heart of the manse. In it, Nurgle concocts new poisons and diseases to unleash on the Immaterium, with the all-healing Isha's recovery time used as a barometer of effectiveness for the plague. Nurgle itself is similar in form and mannerisms to the greater demons that lead its plague legions, though obviously it is much, much larger and probably even more jovial until you annoy it. There are 7 categories of Plague Legion, with who knows how many of each type, with each individual legion at full strength being formed of 7 of what are known as Talibans. As you might have guessed, Nurgle's sacred number is 7, and it appears all over the place. Even the number of the Astartes legions serving it is a number that is a multiple of 7, though that may have just been coincidence. Honestly though, if Tzeentch's number is to be 9, then Nurgle's really should have been 6. It's 9 upside down, thus showing that Nurgle is the opposite and yet intrinsically tied to Tzeentch. But I don't make the rules around these things, so I suppose it doesn't really matter what I think. The last of the major Chaos gods, both in age and most often in power, is Slaanesh. Unlike the other major gods that awoke around M2, Slaanesh was gestated and birthed within the warp much, much later, M30 in fact. You may have heard the story of Slaanesh before, but just in case you haven't, settle in for the tale of the fall of the Eldari, Well, the short version. The Eldari Empire was the most dominant in the galaxy for millennia, having possibly ascended to power as early as the post-War in Heaven era after defeating the Necrons. However, the Eldari were so dominant that they got bored and lazy, using constructs to fight their wars and indulging their every desire and whim back home. These emotions, these feelings of luxury, excess and indulgence, combined with the capricious nature of many Eldari within the warp during the era known to humanity as the Age of Strife. As pleasure cults sprung up in the Eldari Empire and debased debauchery ran amok, the entity they were unknowingly creating drunk in and gorged on the emotion and the power until it was ready to awaken. At that moment, the Eldari fell and Slaanesh was truly born. The Eye of Terror was formed at the heart of their empire, and their pantheon was said to be devoured by the ravenously hungry Slaanesh, along with billions of Eldari souls. Slaanesh itself is known as the Prince of Pleasure or She Who Thirsts, among other names. It depends on who you ask. And it remains, of course, a deity of twisted pleasure and excess. This puts it actually in direct opposition to Khorne. The blood god may loathe Tzeentch for its use of sorcery, but the self-indulgent nature of Slaanesh stands in stark, insulting contrast to the uncaring and blind rage of Khorne. As such, the pair are rivals, just as Nurgle and Tzeentch are, with Slaanesh taking particular umbrage at Khorne's obsession with murder and death. Can't imagine why. Service of Slaanesh for mortals is often more brazen, but just as insidious as that of Tzeentch. They will not swear openly to the Prince of Pleasure, nor bear its mark quite often, but they will dress, live and act in an indulgent, excessive fashion. This is true of both political and military assets of She Who Thirsts, and this appeal to luxury and hedonism is what allows Slaanesh to get a grip over the ruling classes of many worlds. When the time for war finally comes, Slaanesh's armies, both mortal and demonic, are a riot of colour, sound and bloodshed. Demons can feed on the pain of others as an almost perverse form of pleasure, and mortals will often take the same pleasure from their own pain and suffering. All this emotion, all this excess feeds on Slaanesh and makes it one of the most natural counters to the other Chaos gods. All of them take their emotions, rage, hope, joy and mirth to excessive levels, and that excess powers up the Dark Prince in turn. However, there is one thing that Slaanesh desires above all else, the souls of the Eldari that birthed it millennia ago. The souls of dead Eldari are forfeit to Slaanesh, forcing the entire species to adapt in one way or another to avoid a fate they consider far, far worse than death. Slaanesh makes it home in the warp, in a place known as the Palace of Pleasure, but to get to it requires passing through a series of regions arranged in concentric circles. Each of these circles plays on different desires of the individuals walking through them. Gluttony, avarice, power and more must be overcome in turn, with even the slightest slip at any point resulting in internal damnation and ensnarement within the circle. Very rarely has any mortal made it through the palace's traps and defences. In fact, I believe I've only heard of maybe one or two who've ever even got to the palace. But those who do will come face to face with the Palace of Pleasure and maybe, just maybe in the throne room, Slaanesh itself. Commonly depicted as a half-male, half-female, pseudo-humanoid figure, Slaanesh is able to take any form, but remains a horrifying beauty throughout. Any mortal said to look upon Slaanesh in person is lost and damned then and there, No matter their skills in the circles, their soul is forfeit to she who thirsts, and they become another servant and thrall to Slaanesh. The Prince of Pleasure is waited upon by demonic handmaidens within the palace, but when the demons go to war, they form the Legions of Excess. In a similar style to Nurgle's Plague Legions, there are 6 types of legions, with who knows how many of each type. There are 6 formations within each legion below the commanding greater demons, though the capricious demons will flit between them as their mood dictates. Following the deductions that we took with the other major gods, we can imply that Slaanesh's sacred number is 6. The Palace of Pleasure has 6 rings around it to defend it, the Astartes legion number is half of that, but as always we have no logic as to why. I don't even believe 6 is a number that's important to the Eldari, which would have been my next place to look to check out why. I guess some things just aren't meant to be known. Whilst we have now covered all 4 of the major Chaos gods, there are other minor entities projecting their power from the warp. We know a small amount about one, whilst the others are near unknown or perhaps even mere speculation, but let's cover what we do know before we close up. The best known of the minor Chaos gods, though still mostly mysterious, is the one known as Malice. I've heard Malal used as a name before, but I believe officially that it's Malice. This god has many epithets, just like the major gods, such as the Outcast or the Hierarch of Anarchy and Terror. As a Chaos god, you would think that Malice is involved in the Great Game, though likely fighting from a much weaker position. But that doesn't appear to be the case. Instead, Malice is an enemy of all the Chaos gods, an outcast among the ruinous powers fighting for its own ends and reasons. Said reasons, mind you, appear to be about spreading as much chaos, with a lowercase c, and anarchy as possible, hence the epithets that I told you. This means that Malice and its followers will attack anyone, often for seemingly no reason other than just being there to be attacked. Malice is believed to have a sacred number of its own, 11, but it's the last thing we know about it that intrigues me most. A ritual performed by the Sons of Malice, a renegade Astartes warband in service of the Outcast, saw 11 of their champions sacrificed in order to, somehow, bring Malice into the Immaterium for a short period of time. It required a mortal shell to be possessed, just as it would to summon a demon, but the implications are staggering regardless of that fact. A Chaos god, yes, a minor one, but a Chaos god can be summoned into reality, something I previously believed impossible, either because the gods were bound to the warp or were just too powerful. It may be that the gods, the major ones anyway, are too powerful. There may be no host able to sustain them, save possibly the Emperor, but it's still quite terrifying to consider nonetheless. The other minor Chaos god that we know about or can speculate about, not counting some nameless god maybe worshipped by the Raptors of the Heretic Astartes and the Emperor because that's not enough evidence, is the god perhaps most closely related to Slaanesh in some ways, interestingly. I say this not because it's a god of excess, that would just be powering up Slaanesh, but rather it is a reflection of the attitudes and emotions of a particular species gestating within the warp. In this case, the Chaos God seems to be a manifestation of the Tau Va, the greater good. From the limited descriptions given by the Tau's 4th sphere of expansion, this being is believed to be a many-armed yet Tau-like figure that follows and adheres to the codes of the Tau Va. As for whether you think this was just a warp hallucination because the Tau had never been in the warp before, I suspect it wasn't. The 4th sphere testify that this being was the one to save them from death in the Immaterium after they were dragged into the warp following the disaster at Numenor Point. Even so, the Tau of the 4th sphere have actually come to hate this being, this god of the greater good, if you will, despite it being their salvation. The now xenophobic members of that sphere saw it as a perversion of the Tau Va, created by their more psychic auxiliaries. Time will tell whether this god will grow or be annihilated by the others, whether it even actually exists, and if it does, whether it and the Tau become connected in harmony or in revulsion like Slaanesh and the Eldari. But the fact is, it's there, and the fact it's there at all shows how quickly the warp could adapt to even a small group of individuals with a low psychic potential on the galactic scale. And there you have it, as comprehensive and up-to-date a guide as I can feasibly provide on the Chaos Gods without repeating myself too much on the Legiones Daemonica. If you wish to find out about the armies of the gods, both mortal and especially demonic, they're off in the archive somewhere if you trawl around hard enough. Suffice it to say, the ruinous powers, the dark gods, whatever you choose to call them, are probably the greatest threat to life in the galaxy due to their power and influence. But at the same time, they must maintain the galaxy's life and emotion in order to sustain themselves, like an interdimensional ecosystem that I mentioned before. For now though, we must stop our look into the Chaos Gods and move ourselves on. I think our next log will take us out of the warp and back into the Immaterium, as I want to look at a very different type of ruler to the ruinous powers. Perhaps the most numerous of war leaders in the entire galaxy, well, maybe humans. They are both unique yet similar in both appearance, outlook, and waging war. Thank you for watching Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.